By 1959, the Southside Chicago was a powder keg, and Woodlawn was being systematically hollowed out. White folks were scrambling, running scared. We talking damn near 90% of the white population packed up and left, a direct consequence of that dirty block-busting hustle, followed by the redlining of the community. All that remained was blight and busted dreams, and an abandonment of businesses and properties. The black community moved in looking for sanctuary, but found a war zone. This new community faced brutal treatment from the Chicago police, and with crime rising, protection was needed. Older cats from the Upper South Side, the Devil's Disciples, and the Egyptian Cobras rolled into Woodlawn in 1958. They were supposed to be protection, see? But the street is the street. In no time, the Cobras and the Disciples were beefing with each other. East Woodlawn belonged to the Cobras, plain and simple. On the west side, the Vice Lords were putting in work setting the blueprint for organization. One of the founders, a heavy hitter named Leonard Calloway, an Imperial chaplain before he was a Vice Lord, had family right here in Woodlawn. Cal was fam to 15-year-old Eugene Lil Bruce Harrison. See, Harrison wasn't even from around here, born in Ohio and moved to Chicago in '55. He first landed in the low end before relocating to Woodlawn in 1956 near Stony Island Avenue. When he settled in Woodlawn, the boy got a crash course in the hustle. He linked up with the neighborhood pimps, hustlers, drug peddlers, and gamblers. That's where he got his charisma. He gained serious street respect, and that's how Eugene Hairston earned his name, Bull. Later on, they'd call him King Bull. Hairston's family was more middle class, but they bonded tight with the Fort family from 6536 Blackstone Ave. The Forts were different. They came up in that southern migration wave from Aberdeen, Mississippi. John and Annie Fort were cotton pickers. After moving from the near south side, they relocated to Woodlawn in 1956, the same year as the Hairstons, and their families bonded tight. It was through this bond that Eugene Hairston and Little Jeff Fort became friends. Fort, born in 1947, was 3 years younger, putting him square in Bull's shadow early on. Jeff had behavioral problems, catching trouble at school and home. When he'd run away, he'd stay with Cal Calloway on the west side. That's where Jeff witnessed the real deal, the Vice Lords' plotting strategy for conquering North Lawndale. Fort and Hairston didn't just learn how to fight, they learned how to be conquerors and leaders, how to draw up a constitution and lay down the bylaws for an organization. November 1959, Jeff Fort finally made his move and assembled the Blackstone Rangers. At first they were just thieves, snatching purses and breaking into stores, but they fought battles with the much larger Egyptian Cobras. Fort lived right on 65th Place and Blackstone at 6536 Blackstone Ave, so his turf was set 64th Street down to 66th Street along Blackstone Avenue. At the same time, Bull Hairston started his own crew, the Harper's Boys, named after the street they formed on between 63rd and 64th. The Harper's Boys, about a dozen guys, claimed Jackson Park from 63rd down to 67th along Stony Island Ave. Though Fort and Hairston were tight friends, once they broke off to start their own gangs, they immediately became bitter rivals. They fought the Cobras and Disciples, but they also fought each other tooth and nail. The beef got deadly when the Rangers shot Carl Robinson with a zip gun, escalating the war. While they fought for dominance, the authorities began to clock the Blackstone Rangers' name more often than the Harper's Boys, whose members were often simply referred to as Rangers. In 1960, Fort went on a conquest to claim the corner of 63rd and Stony Island, a bad area he wanted to call the Enchanted City. He wanted to dominate the corner, set rules of conduct, and control the criminal groups to make the community safer. But he couldn't hold that corner. He ran into too many wars with the Harper's Boys and other crews. Hairston and Fort eventually had to face the facts. They couldn't defeat each other. In 1960, they merged as one organization. Hairston didn't like the name Blackstone Ranger, but since it was the recognized name on the streets, he reluctantly accepted it. The real power move came from the neighborhood African American syndicates. Hairston already had connections and was mentored by them, doing favors on the side. Now the syndicates, the drug dealers, the pimps, the illegal gambling operators saw an opportunity in the Rangers' viciousness and street influence. They had plans for these boys. They were willing to pay the boys to be drug couriers, collect extortion, or even carry out contracted killings. The syndicates loved using these youths, most under the age of 17, because they could do the dirty and dangerous jobs for next to nothing and avoid the serious jail time adults would face. They taught them to hustle, installed a no snitching policy, and scared them straight with threats. The syndicates formalized the structure. They anointed Eugene Hairston as the head, the big chief, admiring his charisma and toughness. Jeff Fort was appointed Little Chief, tasked with recruitment because he had an incredible ability to draw in youths. Hairston's ability to convince leaders of other gangs to join the Rangers is when the organization really started to balloon in 1960. Once the nation was created in 1960, Eugene Hairston, Lamar Bop Daddy Bell, Charles Rico Crenshaw, and other former Harper's boys created the main 21 ruling body, the constitution and bylaws the Rangers had to live by. The blueprint came from the vice lords declared their first cousins due to family ties. The Rangers quickly focused on black power, adopting African-rooted literature and symbols. They chose the pyramid, which symbolized their belief that ancient Egypt was the first civilization and the roots of African divinity. The 490-degree angles added up to 360 degrees, the circle of the nation. The pyramid was given 21 bricks for the ruling main 21 body, and the Pan-African colors of black, green, and red were adopted. The first conquest as a unified nation outside of Woodlawn was to the South Shore neighborhood in 1960. The Rangers spread south of 67th Street, conquering a section that was just beginning to be settled by African Americans. They grew in popularity with the newly arrived youth by offering protection from rival Devil's Disciples and Egyptian Cobras. This was the beginning of the Black Peace Stones' long legacy here. South Shore became an epicenter for the Stones, home to Terrortown, Sino City, and Murder Show, and housing much of the leadership since 1960. Greater Grand Crossing also became a permanent home in 1960. It was a red-lined, impoverished community that was 85% African American. The Rangers came to deal with the growing crime, quickly battling the Egyptian Cobras and Disciples already present. By 1962, the Rangers likely flipped the Cobras here into Rangers. As early as 1960, the Rangers were receiving assistance from the Woodlawn Lutheran Church and the Woodlawn Boys Club. These organizations needed to inflate their budgets, so they sheltered the Rangers, gave them sanctuary to organize, and provided technical assistance, which ultimately gave the Ranger leaders credibility and fueled more recruitment. The constant syndicate work caught up with the leadership. Jeff Fort and Eugene Hairston did time in the juvenile detention center in 1961. This was the first lockup, but the organization continued under Charles Bear, Edward Bay until the boys were released in 1962. In 1962, the Rangers received a huge boost when they converted the Egyptian Cobras into the King Cobra Stones under Mickey Cogwell. This put the Blackstone Rangers in the Robert Taylor Projects and established their first presence in Inglewood. From 1962 to 1964, the Rangers experienced massive growth, multiplying into the hundreds and absorbing several gangs. Money started to flow in from legitimate, sympathetic organizations, which was a relief for the young Rangers who were tired of splitting heads for pennies. The community cried out for help after a nasty 1964 war between the Rangers and Disciples. Both groups simultaneously embarked upon a Southside settlement conquest to combat racist reactions to blacks moving into white neighborhoods. Fort caught his first adult record in 1964 when he was thrown in jail for a short time for robbery. The Rangers rolled into Auburn Gresham in 1964. This was once a highly coveted white neighborhood, but real estate blockbusting drove mass white flight between 1963 to 1965. Racial conflict and a lack of opportunities for black youths made the community ripe for the Rangers. They spread all over Auburn Gresham and remain one of the strongest Stone followings today. Since the mid-50s, Chatham had been mostly middle-class African American and gang-free. But in 1964, as nearby neighborhoods changed and became impoverished, middle-class African Americans began to move out in the phenomenon known as Black Flight. Poor families moved to Chatham and the Rangers followed, settling south. In 1964, African Americans were historically kept north of 95th Street, but racial conflict and blockbusting made the central area white fright zones. Poverty became a major issue and the Loden Gardens projects were built. The Blackstone Rangers advanced into northern Roseland, taking over the Loden projects and getting deep. By the mid-70s, the Stones had advanced south of 95th Street, spreading major influence as far south as 113th Street. Roseland became one of the Stones' strongest territories. The Black Peace Stones conquest wasn't stopping at the city line. Over in the far southwest side, Washington Heights had seen African American migration start back in the 50s, mainly on the east side near Roseland, where the black middle class was settling. But by 1963, the pace picked up. Blockbusting accelerated, tearing up the community's racial relations. This conflict was the calling card for the gang. The Stones arrived in 1964, likely starting the crew known as Rack City, a deep section running from 91st to 95th, Halstead to Eggleston. As the 60s rolled, white flight pushed further west into the Brainerd area, and the Stones moved right along with it, setting up shop near Brainerd Park and squaring off with the Supreme Gangsters, who arrived in 68. Even though Washington Heights was a middle-class black community, that didn't stop the Stones from running deep sections in places like Racktown, Nateville, and Ducktown. By 1964, the Stones were branching south and didn't stop at the city limit. They reached out into the perilous south suburbs, where racial conflict was already bubbling between black families and whites in places like Harvey, Markham, and Chicago Heights. Suburbs like Ford Heights and Robbins were dirt poor, lacking recreation and proper schools, leaving young black youths bored to death and feeling trapped. When the Black P. Stones rolled up, it was a big deal for these disadvantaged youth looking for an out. In Dixmoor, already 60% African American, the notorious gin bottle riots kicked off in August 1964 after a racial dispute at a liquor store. The Stones arrived right during the chaos, recruiting hard and establishing the notorious Harvey Dixmoor Rangers. Jerome General Jake Crowder, a former member of the activist group the Black Elephants, was scooped up by the Rangers and put in charge of Dixmoor. Crowder then connected with Harvey and got the Stones set up there too. In Harvey, the Stones were the first Chicago gang to settle the streets, likely starting in 1964. The Dixmoor crew started the Harvey Dixmoor Rangers. Jerome Crowder was the Dixmoor founder, and Roger General Tu Bowman was the first chief of the Harvey Stones. Many African Americans had moved to Harvey in a black flight pattern, escaping the crime and blight of areas like Inglewood. But starting in 1964, blockbusting real estate saw Harvey as a gold mine, sparking a severe white flight and intense racial conflict. Impoverished black youths who often didn't fit into the middle-class suburb turned to the Stones out of boredom, low self-esteem, or for protection from white gangs. The racial brawls and arguments, especially at Thornton Township High School, made the papers. By 1972, the white population was gone, leaving the community to sink into poverty and crime, and the Black P. Stones remained the biggest mob in Harvey. The small suburb of Phoenix, just east of Harvey, was swept up in the gin bottle riots too. The Stones arrived after Dixmoor and Harvey around 1964, and they have remained in this small, poverty-stricken suburb ever since. Robbins, originally a philanthropic suburb built for migrating African Americans, failed immediately, becoming blighted and impoverished due to a lack of tax revenue and local corruption. With no proper schooling or recreation, the youths felt trapped. Becoming a Black Stone Ranger was one of the best moves when the mob arrived around 1964. This branch was blessed by King Bull himself. It was started by William Harper, an original member of Eugene Hairston's Harper's Boys crew. The Stones claimed the south and southeast areas of Robbins along 139th Street, and the suburb has been Stone territory for generations. Ford Heights, formerly East Chicago Heights, also had a long history of poverty dating back to the 1930s. The original white residents left after the Depression, not due to racial conflict, but due to upward mobility. They left behind dirt cheap housing for highly impoverished African Americans. By the mid-60s, a second wave of black flight saw the middle class leave, dropping housing values further and opening the door for gang activity. Monty Powell founded the Ford Heights Blackstone Rangers around 1964. Powell was a serious cat. He shot and killed a Ford Heights police officer for confiscating his gun in 1969, an event that made headlines. Chicago Heights, once heavily Italian, saw its east side decay by the 1950s, becoming settled by impoverished African American families. The rest of the suburb wasn't happy, and racial conflict simmered for years, particularly as the city built public housing projects on the polluted east side to contain the black population. Around 1964, the Blackstone Rangers, led by Jerome Branch, became the first Chicago gang to move in, settling right in the projects. These Stones even marched for justice against the white community in 1968, who were determined to keep black residents pinned on the east side. Markham was a middle-class white suburb until 1959. The Dan Ryan Expressway construction pushed African Americans out of impoverished city neighborhoods, triggering a black flight exodus into places like Markham. The new Kingston Green housing subdivision, built in the east side near the Harvey border, accommodated these families. Cut off from the rest of the village and its amenities, the subdivision became fertile ground for gang activity. Willie Tompkins moved in and brought the Stones, calling the branch the Kingston Green Rangers. Around 1964, to understand why the Stones expanded so quickly, you gotta understand the racial strife that paved the way. In these changing communities, young black residents faced a litany of abuses. Bullying in school, white youths used racial slurs and taunts. Unequal treatment by staff, black students faced harsher punishment, were often excluded from student activities, and were left alienated and bored. Unfair neighborhood boundaries. After restrictive covenants were banned, white residents created new, unwritten racial boundaries that usually included all public facilities, pools, parks, and shopping in the white zone. Black youths were left with no choice but to venture into these areas and face violence or taunting, or stay home and endure the boredom that leads to gang activity. Unfair police treatment. New black residents were watched closer and questioned more often. In fights between black and white students, police rarely arrested the white participants, often brutally arresting the black youths involved instead. These issues, though often short-lived as white flight was rapid, were the original cause for the need for a force like the Rangers. The other cause, plain and simple, was boredom. Between 1960 and 1965, the Rangers' money came from small payments from the syndicates and from taxing drug dealers, pimps, hustlers, and gambling houses. They also taxed store owners in exchange for protection from rival gangs and criminals. The leaders, Hairston and Fort, learned the hustle from the older syndicates, who themselves had strong connections to the Italian outfit, the Mafia. Before the Rangers took over, the rackets were run by outsiders who came into the community, caused trouble, and brought heat from the police. White customers seeking drugs and prostitutes were often victims of crime, and when a white man was involved, the police would flood the area, cracking heads of many black men who had nothing to do with it. The Rangers put a stop to this. They cut off the white syndicates who were pimping women and dealing drugs in Ranger areas, keeping the business within the neighborhood and flushing outsiders out. A change began early in 1965 when Ed Woods, the extension director of the Woodlawn Chicago Boys Club, and Reverend O.H. Wilson, Sotanak of Woodlawn Emmanuel Lutheran Church, offered to help the boys get a fresh start. Reverend Sotanak opened his church 3 days a week so the Rangers could meet, play games, and organize dances and parties to raise money. Woods worked directly with Fort and Hairston, helping the youths find employment in communities where jobs were scarce. This positive involvement made Ranger membership even more attractive, and recruitment swelled. It was also in 1965 that Jeff Fort connected with Reverend John Fry of the First Presbyterian Church. Fry saw Fort as the visible leader and offered the church as a meeting place, hoping to guide them into becoming a community-based organization instead of a gang. This connection was pivotal, as Fry offered key guidance that would lead to connections with organizations willing to pay the Rangers to provide public services. The church became a major hangout. They threw wild parties in the gym and even stashed guns in the basement. Despite critics and law enforcement accusing Fry of controlling the Rangers, the Reverend maintained his intention was to prevent gang wars. The church worked with the Woodlawn organization TWO on a Head Start program. This was the prime opportunity that legitimized the Rangers and put them on the payroll. Blackstone Rangers were now earning a salary just for attending meetings and guiding neighborhood youths. Suddenly, Rangers could afford bush top fade haircuts and Converse gym shoes, setting the fashion trend for the whole neighborhood. Kids looked at the Rangers' styling and the number of members, 200 on record, hundreds more citywide, began to boom as they started building an empire going into 1966. Beginning in 1966, major recruitment began to spread north into Inglewood, Grand Boulevard, Douglas, near Southside Oakland, and Kenwood. The Stones even flipped gangs in the Cabrini Green projects on the near north side. The Stone Nation now became an unofficial alliance of gangs, with crews adding either Ranger or Stone to their names, though they still operated somewhat independently. This confederation was necessary to keep up with the rival Disciple Alliance that was also building up across the city. With this new structure, the Rangers now numbered at least 1,500 members on record, with thousands more across the city, reaching as far north as 31st Street. By 1966, Jeff Fort was diving deep into Islamic teachings, exploring his fascination with Islam that dated back to his youth. On December 28th that year, Jeff Fort proposed rebranding the Federation as the Black Peace Stone or Black Prince Stone Nation. The idea was rooted in the Black Stone of Mecca, which Muslims believe came from heaven. This sacred stone, the cornerstone of the Kaaba, tied into the month of December and inspired the birth of the new name and alliance. The Dixmoor Rangers was just one of the 15 branches of the Rangers. The organization was complex, featuring crews like the FBI Rangers, Maniac Rangers, and Gypsy Rangers. Those adopting the Stone name included Cobra Stones, Gangster Stones, and Apache Stones. When the Stone Federation was first assembled in 1966, one of their first stops north was in the Oakland community, home to the Ida B. Wells and Clarence Darrow projects. They flipped older African-American street gangs from 39th to 42nd Street, creating the crew known today as the Sioux Stones. Older gangs like the Deacons either moved out or flipped. Some theorized the younger Deacons became the notorious Deacon Stones. During this takeover, they met Randy Rube Dillard, who ran 43rd Street, and Herbert Thunder Stevens, who ran 39th. These two men took their crew into the Ranger Nation as four cornerstones, quickly spreading into the projects, especially the 727 E30 8th Street building. Another legendary settlement was in the Cabrini Green public housing projects in the near north side. The Rangers met with gang leader Samuel Mac Dillard and brought him and his crew into the nation in 1966. Grand Boulevard, part of the historic Bronzeville area, was the site of the first African-American community in Chicago. When the Stones arrived in 1966, they unified with some of the older gangs, notably the Four Corners gang, creating the Titanic P Stones. Since the Cobras were part of the Stones, the Robert Taylor Projects and Grand Boulevard were slightly part of the nation. West Englewood was slower to transition racially than its neighbor. White gangs like the Gaylords were organized and made the streets tough for African-American youths, especially near Ogden Park. As white flight accelerated in the mid-60s, African-American families moved between 59th and 63rd Street, and racial conflicts brewed. The Gaylords patrolled Sherman Park, kicking out black youths. The Black P Stones arrived in 1966 to fight against both the Gaylords and the Disciples, who are also advancing. These Stones remained in northern West Englewood for decades, advancing up to 55th Street. Beginning in 1966, the Black P Stones first ventured to the west side of Chicago. On August 5, 1966, the Chicago Tribune reported the first evidence: 2 shootings in the North Lawndale neighborhood that either involved or were directly done by the Rangers. Captain Julius H. Watson noted the Supreme Rangers as a newer gang in the area. The August 5, 1966 Chicago Tribune article talking about shootings and the Supreme Rangers didn't know the full story. They were clocking the Stones that had moved in and set up shop at Central Park Avenue and Crenshaw Street. These cats, known as the CPG Stones, held down a liquor store corner, marking the very first West Side Stones in history, a section that is still active today. With a powerful army spread across the South Side, the Rangers aligned themselves with the Black nationalist movement. They were visible when Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago. At a massive rally at Soldier Field, hundreds of Rangers marched in, waving a huge flag and blazing with the .50 caliber machine gun. They surrounded the upper deck, causing genuine fear, but there was zero violence. They were introducing themselves to the Black Liberation Movement and the SCL. After taking SCLC nonviolence workshops, the Rangers marched alongside Dr. King as he moved into white neighborhoods that summer. Chief Bull, Eugene Hairston, was the driver of the Black Power movement within the nation. By 1966, he pushed Rangers to wear afros as a sign of Black pride. Hairston also took a strong stance against drugs, whether for personal use or trafficking. Though he did smoke weed and drink, Jeff Ford was far stricter, avoiding smoking, drinking, and even curse words. The Rangers eventually linked up with the Black Panthers. Despite law enforcement trying to spin the yarn that Jeff Ford ran the Panthers out of town with 100 guns, the truth is simpler. The two groups respected each other but couldn't commit to a coalition after meeting in 1969. The Panthers viewed the Stones as too violent and not political enough. The Stones saw the Panthers as dreamers. There was no violence or hatred between the two. The beef was a police myth. By late 1966, the constant violent beef between the Rangers and Disciples over Woodlawn Avenue was reaching a fever pitch. In the spring of 1967, the Presbyterian Church, partnered with TWO, the Woodlawn organization, secured a massive $927,000 0-cents grant from the Federal Office of Equal Opportunity, OEO, to fight the war on poverty. Task Force President Reverend Arnold Brazier was the gatekeeper. The cash went to the churches who paid the rangers and disciples, split right down the middle, to run educational and job training centers. Jeff Fort himself was paid $6,000, 0 cents a year as a salaried instructor. The program was a huge success initially, getting young black youths off the streets and into jobs or college, saving lives. Ranger popularity soared, hitting 3,000 members on record. The success was fleeting. In November 1967, Jeff Fort was jailed on murder charges, later acquitted. Without Fort's leadership, the program fell apart. Rangers started running fraudulent scams with the grant money, falsely signing attendance sheets and checks. Hairston was also arrested in September 1967 for conspiracy to commit murder. The organization was left rudderless, and the fraud became systemic, setting the stage for government investigations. The Chicago police declared war on the Rangers in 1968, pinning the high crime stats on them and pressuring Reverend Fry for harboring the crew and allowing them to stash weapons in the Presbyterian church. Fry admitted there was a safe full of weapons, claiming they were collected to keep them off the street, but admitted Rangers still moved guns in and out. The police raided the church, often harassing members even when they were meeting with employment representatives. The police targeted Maine 21 members with false arrests, illegal search and seizures, harassment, and beatings. This led to the Rangers having to lawyer up, utilizing Eugene Hairston's connection to the Kettering Foundation. Eugene Hairston's trial for soliciting boys to kill drug dealers was a major blow. He was charged with ordering 4 youths, aged 13-15, to assassinate dealers who were pushing poison onto the streets without authorization. The 13-year-old shooter, Dennis Jackson, was heard shouting, "I hear you was messing with the chief," before firing. Hairston was convicted and sent to Statesville for 5 to 15 years. Law enforcement celebrated, knowing that using juveniles for hits, who faced light sentences, was a method learned first from the syndicates and now replicated by the nation's leaders, though Hairston paid the boys a paltry $6, 0 cents and some food. The real payment was the recognition and respect they gained. The fact that Hairston was convicted on the same weak evidence that saw his loyal follower Paul Martin acquitted suggested a fixed game designed to remove the Stones' primary leader. The war with the disciples raged until a temporary truce was called on March 4, 1968, purely to protect the 000 paychecks. Immediately, the FBI began circulating rumors. False reports provided by the flipped Maine 21 member George Watusi rose that the Stones were preparing for war against the police and were plotting with white communists for weapons. The FBI was desperate, attempting to sabotage peace treaties and even sending letters to gang leaders with false intelligence to pit them against each other. Jeff Fort was released in March 1968 and immediately took total control, restoring order to a nation fractured by internal conflicts. He pushed out Eugene Hairston, who was still tied up in trial. Hairston's most loyal follower, Prophet Paul Martin, opposed the new order and was killed, shot 3 times in the back of the head in an alley in 1969. Fort was now the undisputed leader of an army of 5,000 known soldiers. Fort proved his worth after the Martin Luther King Jr. assassination in April 1968, successfully preventing the South Side from descending into the destructive riots that plagued the West Side. When a group of Stones advanced on a bus full of white students, Fort ordered them to stop immediately, demonstrating the power of discipline and nonviolence when survival was on the line. In July 1968, Senator John McClellan held high-stakes hearings to investigate the OAO grant, summoning Fort as the center chief. The committee hammered Fort, arguing the program was ineffective despite the continued arrests of leaders. Fort, advised by counsel, gave only his name. He then stood up, raised a clenched fist, and walked out, later facing charges for contempt. Crucially, the committee ignored the fact that the Stones had returned $200,000, 0 cents of the grant, and that Fort himself only pocketed about $1,500, 0 cents. The issue was not greed, but control. Despite the government heat, the Stones were still making deals. In 1968, Fort became youth director for the Kenwood Oakland Community Outreach (KOCO) program and received loans to open a restaurant. Fort was also leading marches against housing injustice, but the dark side remained. The Stones were extorting businesses for protection, killing rivals, and shaking down other organizations to control the flow of grant money. Their arrangement with Reverend Burrell in 1969 perfectly demonstrated the control slipping away when Stones demanded pay for work they didn't do, and enraged Burrell fired a gun at the floor. The beef was eventually squashed, but it showed how community organizations were losing their grip on the organization they helped finance. The expansion continued. In Austin, white gangs attacked African American youths migrating from other neighborhoods. The Stones, along with the Vice Lords and Four Corner Hustlers, were called in for defense. Eugene Hairston approved the Austin branch in 1968, leading to the formation of the Deadliest Stones, the Satan Lovers Stones, and the FBI Rangers. The area of Austin from Central to Laramie, Lake Street to Chicago Avenue became known as L-Town, the land of the Stones. By 1968, the Stones also established a presence in South Chicago. A newspaper reported on a Mafia Rangers gang operating there, suspected to be Stones. By the early 80s, the Stones had solidified their mob presence, with crews like the Titanic Stones and Terrytown Extensions making it a massive force. In January 1969, an Illinois politician shocked law enforcement by inviting Jeff Fort to the presidential inauguration ball. Fort declined but sent Henry Mickey Cogwell, the Cobra Stone leader, and Herman Moose Holmes. While Cogwell mingled with high society, Chicago police were home trying to arrest him. When they learned he was invited to the White House, they were furious. This event further cemented the Stone leader's connections to politics and power. In January 1969, Jeff Fort made a calculated move, establishing a business and warfare alliance with Larry Hoover, the leader of the Supreme Gangsters. The two nations had been at war since the Gangsters formed around 1964. By 1968, Hoover's crew was locked in a bloody war with their former close allies, the Disciples. Fort saw his opportunity. The Gangsters were focused purely on hustling and making money, while the Stones were similar but with an underlying activist streak. Hoover accepted the alliance, leading to a ceasefire that held for about 6 months. The truce was fragile, as seen when the Double Six Kings, a Stone crew in Inglewood, thought the war was still on, leading to a violent incident involving Larry Hoover's brother, Charles Hoover. This was the beginning of the end. By the summer of 1969, the Gangsters officially broke the truce and allied with the Disciples, creating the infamous Black Gangster Disciple Nation. The Stones had always been a money-making machine since 1960. Their oldest hustle was running favors and hits for small black syndicate groups on the South Side. Soon, they were making real money by imposing taxes on drug dealers, pimps, gambling dens, and other small rackets. In Stone territories, you couldn't run a hustle without Ranger approval and paying a cut. This evolved into the paid protection racket, where Stones visited local businesses. Many called this scandalous. Pay us or we won't rob you. But in Woodlawn and surrounding communities, which had become high crime zones with scarce police patrols, paying the Stones was often a better option. The Stones offered better security than the police. They would stop their own members from attacking a business and would post signs, often featuring the pyramid symbol, warning everyone that this was Black P Stone property and disrespect to the chief meant dire consequences. Offenders who dared to hit a protected store were often severely beaten in the streets as an example, or worse. The primary targets for this tax were often Jewish-owned businesses that charged higher prices, which the Stones justified as taking some of the extra money back from businesses seen as taking advantage of the community. Black-owned businesses were often protected for free. The Stones used sophisticated methods for collection. Different young boys were sent each time, often members brought in from outside the neighborhood, so their faces wouldn't be known. Jeff Fort and others saw the Stones as guardians in the black community, and the protection plan was part of that role. They also controlled the drug trade by taxing and monitoring all dealers, controlling how business was carried out and what types of customers came in. In the 60s, the Stones themselves were not drug dealers, and rules explicitly forbade the sale and use of drugs for the nation. Fort had even once threatened Milwaukee outfit leader Frank Balistreri over supplying heroin to the community. That stance, however, was about to change. Eugene Hairston's 1967 murder conviction was based on the charge that he was eliminating 3 non-gang related heroin couriers who were bringing dope into the community off the Stones' radar. Hairston always aimed to prohibit outfit-connected dealers from operating in Stone territories. This moral boundary collapsed when Mickey Cogwell and Ryko Cranshaw explored the possibility of the Stones getting into the direct sales of drugs. Cogwell, who already had outfit connections through the policy numbers racket and controlling clubs and restaurants, was instrumental. He was even known for providing muscle to extort business owners to unionize under outfit-controlled unions. With government funding virtually dried up by 1969 due to the Senate investigations, Cogwell and Cranshaw were the first to bring the nation into the direct drug trade. Chicago police claim they have surveillance of Stone's meeting with Italian mafia associates, including Joseph Little Caesar DeVarco and Joseph Big Joe Arnold, to discuss the business, mainly heroin and prescription teas and blues. The motivation was survival. The Stones had swelled to over 6,000 members by 1969, and legitimate money was gone. This move made the Stones the first Chicago gang to engage in high-level drug marketing, earning Jeff Fort the reputation as the king of the heroin business, even though he wasn't involved in the initial deal. This started specifically with Cranshaw's and Cogwell's co-Stones. This deal brought major heroin distribution to the Robert Taylor projects, particularly The Hole, the 3 buildings near 53rd and State. In 1969, the Stones made a big move, taking over the partially abandoned Southmore Hotel at 67th and Stony Island, right on the border of Woodlawn and South Shore. Legend has it that the Stones harassed the owners until they forced them out, claiming the top floor penthouse as their new headquarters. They barricaded the hallway with furniture and installed lookouts on the roof. The hotel was prime property because it sat next to a series of hidden trails, a secret network that branched throughout the South Shore community, extending down to Woodhall Park, South Chicago, and even north into Hyde Park and Kenwood. This system allowed large groups of Stones to move in silence along the south side without detection, perfect for surprise attacks or theft operations. For nearly 20 years, the Stones controlled this network until the city covered the trails over in the late 1980s. By 1969, a street war erupted between law enforcement and the Stones. Police continued to raid Stone hangouts, and the brutality against young black males on the street and in custody was escalating, sometimes resulting in death. Law enforcement saw the Stones as dangerous animals, and their tactics became increasingly brutal, affecting even disciple leader David Barksdale. Frustrations reached a peak in March 1969 with the shooting of Officer Richard Peck, who was hit at least 15 times while sitting in his squad car at 62nd and Woodlawn. Stones were the shooters. Though Peck survived, the police launched an all-out war. Ford himself was charged with battery of a postal worker in June 1969. While in jail in the summer of 1969, Ford learned that Maine 21 member William Thrope was deep in the heroin hustle, just like Cogwell and Cranshaw, connecting to the Italian outfit through a West Side link. Thrope was hooking many Maine 21 members into the trade. Ford, needing $80,000 in bail money, reluctantly authorized the business, a move Eugene Hairston would have never allowed, and demanded payment. Thrope failed to pay the full debt and was eventually shot up for stiffing the chief. By the autumn of 1969, the drug game was officially sanctioned by Ford, the top leadership. The persistent story about Jeff Fort personally meeting Milwaukee outfit leader Frank Balistreri to take over the drug game, supposedly arranged by youth worker Charles LaPaglia, has major holes. The story claims Balistreri disrespectfully tossed Ford's 10,000 fur coat on the floor. However, Balistreri was in federal prison from March 1967 to June 1971. During that time, either Hairston was in charge, who would never have sanctioned heroin, or Fort was in and out of jail. A meeting with Fort likely couldn't have happened before 1976, by which time Fort had already converted to the El Ruknet doctrines, which initially outlawed heroin. The main hookup into the trade was solidified in the fall of 1969, likely without the chief present. Stone style bar. The late 1960s, the Stone look was unmistakable. Afros, dark Ray-Ban sunglasses, combat boots, and red berets. For going out, they rocked long fur coats, stylish hats, pimp canes, and platform shoes, bringing vibrant color into the 1970 1970 proved a heavy year. On August 14, patrolman James Alfano was shot by snipers on the Southmore Hotel roof while investigating a gang fight outside. Alfano died 2 days later. The shooting was a direct result of the Stones' frustration after police had brutally raided the headquarters and beaten members. The Stones were at their breaking point and opened fire on any police who came near the hotel. Maine 21 leader Charles Edward Bay was arrested for the shooting, and the world saw the ugliest side of the Stones. The subsequent Stones press conference, meant to share their side, was broken up by police claiming gunfire, though reporters heard nothing. The shooting showed how brutal police procedures could cost the life of an innocent officer. Later in 1970, Fort faced new bogus charges of attempted murder and kidnapping. He fled toward Algeria but was caught in New York and was out by December. After winning the case, he was arrested again after leading a peaceful protest at the University of Chicago to rename Midway Plaisance after the recently slain Stone Jerome Pony Soldier Cogwell. All these legal battles chipped away at Fort Time, causing internal strife in the nation. In the South Shore community at the intersection of 76th Street and Phillip Avenue, a nexus of social services and apartment buildings, a new branch formed in 1970. Jackie "Jack Black" Kelly, a 16-year-old with potential working in social services, was spotted by Jeff Fort. Fort offered Kelly a leadership spot, and Kelly founded the Jet Black Stones, or Jets. Jet referring to taking off on any opposition. The Jets quickly became a legendary group, moving into the Washington Park projects at 44th and Evans. In 1970, a Cobra Stone member named Charles Teddy Bear Hartwick moved to the southeast side of the Back of the Yards community as white flight ramped up. By 1971, Teddy Bear was recruiting and, blessed by Mickey Cogwell, established the King Cobra Stones as the biggest gang in the area. Since they were BPSN members, they referred to the area as Motown, claiming they were Moors. Motown eventually extended into Inglewood, taking territory from Racine to Wallace, 51st to 56th Street. This section was BPSN territory until the King Cobra Stones split in 1977. In the Pullman community, the Stones moved into the Cottage Grove Heights subdivision between 95th and 97th Streets by 1969, battling white groups who met at the Florence Hotel to prevent black migration. In the Oakdale Gardens projects in Riverdale, the Titan Stones settled on 133rd Street in the Block 4 buildings in 1969, engaging in battles with white groups and mainly the Black Gangster Disciples. In 1969, the busing of Southside African American youths to Senn High School in the Northside neighborhood of Uptown led to black families settling there. The Stones settled in the Broadway and Argyle area in 1969, becoming the first black P Stone section on the north side. This infuriated white gangs like the Gaylords and Uptown Rebels, who had just started. The Stones survived these streets for decades, especially in the Argyle section. More trouble hit in April 1971 when Jeff Fort and other top Maine 21 members were charged with defrauding the federal government. Fort was now locked up during his trials, leaving the streets without a central leader. Authorities thought they were destroying the Stones, but they were actually creating a wild, disorganized force. The Stones, having been set up to rely on centralized leadership, began to falter. The easy access to drugs caused Maine 21 members to feud over profits and even start using heroin themselves. Fort was convicted in 1972, sentenced to 5 years with 1 year served, and sent to Statesville Prison in Crest Hill, Illinois. While Fort and Hairston were locked up, Hairston and Joliet Correctional, they became rivals, struggling to maintain order from behind bars. To enforce discipline and maintain order while locked up, Fort resorted to extreme measures. Maine 21 members who showed disloyalty or broke laws were executed. In May 1974, Fort sought to gain control of the coveted Oakwood and Drexel intersection in Oakland, moving to run out all drug competition in the nearby public housing projects. This campaign began with the murder of Gilbert Collins near 38th and Cottage Grove by a Stone hit squad. The target was actually his brother Michael, but the message was sent. The Stones were coming to run it. The same hit squad later assassinated Gregory Freeman near 40th and Drexel. Fort also pursued disloyal members. Maine 21 members Willie McLilley and Roy Love were assassinated on November 29, 1974 in Chatham for mishandling the narcotics trade. The hit squad, allegedly acting on orders from Fort, sent a clear message about disloyalty and greed. In late 1974, Christiana Bay, National Secretary for the Moorish Science Temple of America (MSTA), visited both Fort and Hairston in prison. Hairston dismissed her, but Fort was receptive. Bay taught Fort that Black Americans descended from Asiatics and Moors, part of a superior civilization that was enslaved only because George Washington covered up their true identity as Moors who were exempt from slavery. Teachings held that Islam was the natural religion of Africans and the black man was superior to the white man. These teachings were empowering for Fort. He continued his visits even after being transferred to Leavenworth Federal Prison. By 1975, Jeff Fort was fully converted to the Nation of Islam following the MSTA teachings, a major step that the MSTA hoped would convert the entire BPSN. While Jeff Fort was converting to Islam in Leavenworth, Eugene Hairston ran into trouble at Joliet Correctional, accused of threatening a fellow BPS-affiliated inmate who wanted out, and allegedly receiving drugs from a religious group called Beni Zakin to help him control the prison. A riot broke out on April 22, 1975, resulting in 1 death. Hairston denied the charges but was transferred far away to Menard Correctional in southern Illinois to sever his Chicago connections. Before the transfer, Fort had given Herbert Thunder Stevens, leader of the Titanic P Stones, formerly Four Cornerstones out of Brownsville, full control of Statesville. Stevens was in the rare position of being on good terms with both Fort and Hairston. Fort was locked up until March 1976, but Hairston was up for parole later in 1975. Stevens hedged his bets on the man most likely to return and take over, throwing the Titanics under Hairston's wing. Hairston was now running the BPSN in both prisons, a massive power move. Hairston ordered his younger brother, Leroy Lil Bull Hairston, to link up with the Titanics on 43rd Street and assume immediate street leadership. Lil Bull's attempted coup gained momentum concerning Fort's majority supporters. Mickey Cogwell stayed neutral concerning taking his Cobra Stones independent. Fort appointed his own younger brother Benny Fort to rally Fort's supporters. A messy war broke out between the younger brothers in 1975, which landed Lil Bull in prison. Facing Hairston's impending parole, Jeff Fort called Mickey, convincing him to step up as the acting chief over Benny. Cogwell took control of Fort's supporters, and his respected name quickly drew many of Hairston's defectors to his side. The Titanics were the main branch still loyal to Bull. However, in Statesville, Fort's Stones reclaimed power from Thunder. The Titanic Stones in the prison system dissolved, and on the streets, Willie Dollar Bill Bibbs took the Titanics under Jeff Fort's side, effectively ending Bull's coup attempt. Later in 1975, Eugene Hairston was granted parole and returned to a small crew of loyalists. Fort's guys weren't taking any chances. While there is no evidence Jeff Fort ordered the hit, an assassination attempt certainly occurred. As Hairston walked near 70th and Paxton, a man jumped out of a car and fired 8 bullets, 2 striking his left wrist and 1 hitting his back. Hairston fled into a nearby cleaners and survived. Realizing he couldn't retake the Stones, Hairston packed up and moved to the Ida B. Wells projects. Any crews that maintained loyalty to him were now simply called Black Stones, no longer Black P Stone. In 1975, the mostly white Lincoln Square community saw an influx of African Americans from the South Side, relocating to Section 8 friendly apartments near the Loyola soccer fields. This migration was met with discrimination and racial harassment from local gangs like the Gaylords and the migrating Insane Popes. Black P Stones set up a branch in these apartments specifically to safeguard the black community. When the Latin Kings arrived the same year, the focus of the white gangs shifted to them. The Stones would later ally with the Latin Kings. These Stones survived gentrification, while the Gaylords and Popes eventually faded. On March 12, 1976, Jeff Fort was released from Leavenworth with the stipulation that he could not officially live in Chicago. He moved to Milwaukee where he had family. Fort returned with the Moorish Science Temple teachings, throwing an open house celebration to share his new spiritual beliefs. Some leaders respected the new direction, but many others felt the new Muslim religion was foreign and rejected it. The nation once again set a trend, replacing afros with braided hair or cornrows, and colorful 70s fashion with simple shirts and pants. The most devout wore Fulani straw hats. Fort was now referred to as Chief Malik, Malik meaning king in Arabic. In April 1976, Fort prepared to re-enter Chicago by linking up with James Prince Yak Brantley, who had started the B'nai Zakin movement, Hebrew for Black Stones. Prince Yak, an older mentor, helped Fort stabilize the transition in Milwaukee and led the Israelite Stones, a branch embracing the Black Hebrew faith, from his temple, the camp at 42nd and Prairie. It was at the Titanic Peace Stone headquarters at 43rd in Indiana that Fort declared the El Ruknos, meaning cornerstones in Arabic, as the official replacement for the Black Peace Stone name, and disbanded the main 21. The most vocal objector was Eugene Hairston, who was present. Hairston called the mixture of religion and gangsterism hypocritical. An argument broke out and Ford ordered Hairston's death on the spot, but Prince Yak intervened. Instead, Ford declared Hairston completely out of the organization for good. Though Hairston warned it would be the nation's downfall, Hairston walked out, remaining only the chief of the small Blackstones faction. Ford replaced the main 21 with personally appointed generals, including Felix Mays, Alan Knox, and Jake Crowder. He also appointed a group of enforcers like Harry Evans and Earl Hawkins. The Moroccan tribe was one of the first groups to drop the Stone name, settling in the Lake Park projects at 3939S Lake Park, extending through Oakland into Kenwood. They were early Islamic converts who studied the Holy Quran and wore blue phases. They were unique, maintaining peace with both El Rutskins and Stones, but had a fierce rivalry with the Black Gangster disciples. Eugene Hairston's Black Stones fractured further into the Kingston Raiders, 72nd to 75th in Kingston, and the Kingston Killers, 79th to 82nd in Kingston and South Chicago. Both were enemies and terrorized Southside high schools. Herbert Thunder Stevens was the key man who could unite these Hairston supporters. It became a myth that Jeff Ford threatened to kill anyone who didn't convert to Al Rukni. The truth was, if you didn't convert, you were simply declared nothing, neither a Stone nor an El Rukni. The Black Peace Stone name was officially replaced, but leaders like Mickey Cogwell ignored Ford and kept the Black Peace Stones alive, maintaining loyalty to the now paroled Eugene Hairston. On February 25, 1977, Mickey Cogwell was shot and killed outside his Auburn, Gresham home. Though many suspected El Rooks because he refused to convert, there was no evidence. The more likely scenario was a mob hit, as one of his close Italian associates was killed around the same time. Regardless, the Cobra Stones left the Black Peace Stone Nation that year and became the Mickey Cobras. In 1977, Fort purchased property at 3947 S. Drexel, the former Oakwood Theater, and converted it into the Al Rook Moorish Science Mosque. This building, nicknamed the Fort, became their headquarters. Fort moved back to Chicago in 1978, avoiding any legal backlash. How he managed this remains unclear. Upon his return, he began transforming the El Rook Moorish into his own religion, renaming the headquarters the El Rook Grand Major Temple. El Rukni laws technically followed Islamic law: no pork, alcohol, drugs, even marijuana, and no cursing. Ford himself easily followed these rules. The biggest contradiction was the deep involvement in the drug trade. While heroin was technically forbidden in the early years, the El Rooms dominated the market for teas and blues, Tauin, and pyrobenzamine. They also distributed PCP, codeine syrup, amphetamines, marijuana, and cocaine. Edward Ranger Williams became perhaps Fort's biggest earner, specializing in massive quantities of codeine, which he sold out of locations like the Ida B. Wells projects and South Shore Apartments, handing over a large portion of the profits to Fort. The biggest motivation for this massive drug operation was not purely personal wealth, but to fund the religious cause of the organization and ensure its growth. The public and authorities were more terrified of the El Roms than they ever were of the Black Peace Stones. The combination of devout Muslim identity, religious garb, Arabic language, with their swift, often brutal executions and drug sales created a frightening public image. The media fueled fear of Middle Eastern extremists in the 1970s was immediately transferred to the El Roms. The El Rukins, however, were not a conventional street gang. New recruits were often older, some even college-educated men in their 30s who had no prior criminal records and did not engage in typical gang violence like tagging or wild shootings. They were not recruiting young kids in schoolyards. The El Rukins purchased and used over a dozen buildings for operations, ranging from drug houses to meeting places, including the Ford Ultimate Headquarters, the East Side Large Apartment Complex, the Morocco Woodlawn Apartment Building, Pyramid Towers, Wedgwood, now torn down, 5 Point Terrace, major operation until 1984. The El Roots also operated in suburbs like Harvey, Evanston, and Skokie, often utilizing the Chicago-Milwaukee pipeline for drug movement. By 1979, Jeff Fort grew enraged because the Black P. Stones were carrying out crimes that were being blamed on the El Roots, and the Stones were receiving credit for hits the El Roots wanted credit for. Fort issued sanctions. Being a Black P. Stone was no longer a choice, it meant death. Herbert Thunder Stevens, one of Harrison's top supporters, was one of the first major casualties, shot dead in a Harold's Chicken parking lot in South Shore. While some blamed the Sircon City Black Gangster Disciples, many suspected Jeff Fort and the El Runks. This escalated bad blood with the surviving Black P. Stones and the Mickey Cobras. In the prison system, the new order was enforced by a group known as the Cornerstones. This sanction met heavy resistance when the man-rejigger Vice Lords allied with the elite renegade Vice Lords, giving birth to the Renegade Stones. In 1979, early prison release programs and Section 8 expansion brought new residents and gangs to the safe, clean LeClaire Courts public housing project in Garfield Ridge. Four Corner Hustlers, conservative Vice Lords, Mafia Insane Vice Lords, and Black P. Stones moved in. Surprisingly, these groups remained peaceful and were even approved by the local Insane Popes, who joined the People Alliance alongside the Vice Lords due to this temporary truce. For decades, Black folks weren't allowed north of 55th Street west of Wallace, with the Gaylords enforcing this line between 1966 and 1976. Though the Motown King Cobra Stones, a stone group, ran the southeast back of the yards in the 70s, they had since become Mickey Cobras. In the mid-70s, Stones pushed north in West Inglewood to 55th Street, but the Latin Souls served as the new border guards. However, in the late 70s, white flight emptied the Sherman Park area. The Latin Souls wanted no part of the Stones moving in, and conflict erupted. This brought the jet Black Stones to the Sherman Park area to recruit in 1980. The Stones grew fast, teaming up with Latin Kings who were forming north of the park. The Stones hit the Souls viciously, forcing them to move north to 49th Street within a year. The Stones and the Latin Kings of 53rd and Ada then conquered most of Sherman Park, further cementing the early origin story of Motown. The Stones had tried to settle in Maywood after racial riots in the late 60s, but local police quickly shut them down. By 1980, blockbusting and white flight had plunged Maywood into poverty. Facing tensions with white groups, Latin Kings, and Black Gangster Disciples, many Black youths chose to join the Stones over other people mobs like Vice Lords. This finally established a deep and active Black P. Stone presence in Maywood. Bellwood saw similar racial issues and a rise of Black Gangster Disciples, leading to the Stones' successful colonization in 1980, where they also grew deep in numbers. In Bolingbrook, a Will County suburb, the Stones were one of the first Chicago gangs to arrive in 1980. They became deeply entrenched, especially in the low-income apartment and townhouse complexes of the Beacon Ridge subdivision, becoming a major force in the suburb throughout the 90s. Following the 1978 Stateville prison protests against harsh conditions, two coalitions began to form. One side became the Folks, organizing quickly behind bars. The opposing side, often called Brothers, lagged due to street conflicts. In 1981, with the Folks spreading to the streets, Jeff Fort became the frontrunner for organizing the opposition. He gathered El Rucks, Black P. Stones, Vice Lords, and Latin Kings at the Fort. They drafted the People Alliance, incorporating both Christian and Islamic fundamentals. Fort donated the 5-point star to symbolize this unity. The People Alliance ended the sanctions, but not all blacks shed against all Black P. Stone groups. This alliance cemented strong relations between the Black P. Stones and the Latin Kings and improved ties with the Vice Lords and Mickey Cobras. The year 1980 was a period of takeovers and vicious takedowns. El Rums fought rival gangs and brutally enforced sanctions against disobedient Black P. Stones. This violence caused many Stones to flip to conservative Vice Lords, Insane Vice Lords, and Four Corner Hustlers, effectively inviting these West Side mobs to set up shop on the South Side. The El Rooks operated with precise mob-style efficiency, eliminating not only targets but also witnesses to their actions, and were known to intimidate jurors or court witnesses. The El Rootans took over the Alhambra property through brute force on feast day, August 8, 1980. Ford ordered his men to storm the building, kicking out dealers and confiscating all their drugs, guns, and cash. Among the dealers were Titanic Stone higher-ups Barnett Hall and Duke Thomas. El Rutens reportedly took $10,000 and $15,000 in cash from Hall. Earlier that year, Willie Dollar Bill Bibbs, a major T's and Blues dealer, briefly joined the Alricsons, boosting their drug supply. However, Bibbs flipped back to the Titanics in 1981, taking a large chunk of the T's and Blues market with him. The Titanics now cornered 30% of the market in raging Ford. Ford sanctioned the elimination of the Titanics, leading to the infamous 43rd Street Massacre on June 15, 1981. Ford sent 3 armed killers, including Derek Keyes, to a playground at 40th and Indiana, a known Titanic drug spot. They opened fire but only managed to hit Bibbs, the primary target. Ford followed up by ordering the successful execution of Barnett Hall on December 23, 1981. In November 1982, Ford, believing he had a sign from Allah, ordered the elimination of the remaining Titanic leadership, including Duke Thomas and Chalmers Tyler. The Elrucks began calling the Titanic's Gophers because they kept popping up with new leaders. The hits were brutal but often botched. January 1983, a hit squad, including Derek Keyes and William Doyle, missed Duke Thomas but killed a woman driving Thomas's car. February 1983, Chalmers Tyler was shot and killed at 6450 S. Kenwood by Earl Hawkins and J.L. Houston. Later that month, a hit squad accidentally shot 2 other men while trying to hit the Ewing brothers. The Titanics, themselves hardened murder experts, were disadvantaged mainly by being far outnumbered by the El Runks. Eugene Hairston maintained close ties with the Titanics during this war, making him a person of interest for the El Runks. The Titanics and El Runks were the heaviest hitters among all the BPS/Blackstone groups. Despite the sanctions, the Black P Stone name survived because many of the Defiant Stone groups, such as the Maniac P Stones, had family connections to El Ruknin members. El Ruk often allowed these groups to exist or even brought El Ruknin offspring into the BPS nation, keeping the Stone identity alive. El Ruk also imposed taxes on Gangster Disciple and Black Disciple groups in the East Side, South Shore, East Woodlawn, Kenwood, Grand Boulevard, and Oakland. The sanctions and ensuing violence caused the mass depletion of Vice Lord groups in South Shore and Greater Grand Crossing as Stones fought for their survival against both the El Runks and rival Vice Lord factions. Stones were becoming a minority group on the streets compared to other mobs. In April of 1983, Jeff Fort and William Doyle were arrested in Tupelo, Mississippi after dealing cocaine to an undercover agent. Though released that summer, Fort was under heavy investigation. He then connected with Noah Robinson, Reverend Jesse Jackson's half-brother, and Thomas Allen Burnside, a major cocaine distributor. El Roots began buying kilos from Burnside. Jeff Fort was convicted of narcotics trafficking in December 1983 and sentenced to federal prison. He would never see a free day again. Fort continued to run the El Rooms from behind bars, using coded phone conversations ordering everything from drug movement to murder. For instance, he allegedly ordered the 1984 killing of Jerome Fuddy Smith, leader of the Goon Squad gangsters, for infringing on El Rook and cocaine operations in the Ida B. Wells projects. By 1985, Robert Button East, Titanic leader and Hairston ally, was incarcerated for murder, leaving the Titanics to his younger brother Ray Scooter East. Robert East and Eugene Hairston had been working to consolidate the Black P Stone groups against the El Runks, but the imprisonment was a major setback. Scooter East's violent leadership led the Titanics into war with allies like the Mickey Cobras, causing Eugene Hairston to finally fade completely, allegedly becoming addicted to heroin. In 1985, the El Runs lost their cocaine connection, Blue Burnside, to prison. They connected with major Chicago drug dealer Willie Morris Fluky Stokes. The biggest shift came that year. The El Runs, who had forbidden the sale and use of heroin since 1976, finally entered the heroin business. This began in January 1985 with the formation of the Gorilla Family, a group of lower-level El Rutens led by non-member Alexander Cooper, who partnered directly with the imprisoned Jeff Fort to distribute both heroin and cocaine. Guerrillas operated out of El Rutan buildings like the Wedgwood, Pyramid Towers, and the Harper Building, where air-conditioned rooms were used for mixing and packaging dope. Edward Williams, a top general and Fort's biggest earner, oversaw these operations, having previously overseen drug operations at the 5 Point Terrace. Around 1985, Black P. Stones established a major presence along the declining Howard Street corridor, an area once dominated by the Latin kings and vice lords. This area, known as Stone Terrace from Paulina to Western, saw Stones flip several vice lords from the Chicago side of the street. They also migrated north into Evanston. Stone Terrace remains a major zone for the Stones. In the mid-80s, the Ashburn community, long characterized by racial segregation with residents supporting local Nazi KKK organizations near Marquette Park, saw African Americans fully occupy the area east of Western Avenue, a move that triggered white flight. To defend their border and stand up to racial harassment, the Black P. Stones arrived around 79th and Western in the mid-80s. This conflict quickly turned into gang war against the Mexican gang La Raza, but the local white gang, the Insane Popes, sided with the Stones because they both belonged to the People Alliance. The Stones, who remain in the area today, have the deepest history there, though the Gangster Disciples eventually became the majority after white flight was complete. In March 1985, the El Rooks initially authorized King Cobras, an organization historically linked to the Mickey Cobra since 1959, to sell heroin at 67th and Blackstone in Woodlawn, provided they didn't infringe on the Gorilla spot at 67th and Stony Island. This arrangement lasted only a month before the El Rooks felt the Cobras broke the deal. Deotis Clark, a hit squad, found Clark at 67th and Stony Island and shot him in the leg as a warning. Ford also ordered to well done Herman Jackson and Tradus Murray and shoot any King Cobra on sight. In the ensuing violence, Jackson's brother, Robert Dog Jackson, was killed. The El Rookins also attempted to murder Andre Chalmers to exert control over drug operations in the back of the yards area, 54th and Bishop. A squad, including Alan Knox, went to Lonergan's Lounge and tried to kill Chalmers, but instead killed Rico Chalmers, Glenda McKinley, and Vicky Nolden. Authorities alleged that El Runks intimidated witnesses in this murder case. By the end of 1985, the guerrillas disbanded, and El Runks and King Cobras agreed to split 67th Street sales. Cobra selling by day, El Runks by night. In 1985, El Rookins sought to strengthen their spiritual ties abroad. On February 24, 1985, at the Nation of Islam Savior's Day event, 500 El Rookin members attended as allies of Louis Farrakhan. During the event, Colonel Muammar el-Gaddafi of Libya delivered a satellite address encouraging oppressed black people to fight and offering armed assistance. As Gaddafi spoke, Farrakhan asked the El Rookins to stand up, warning the United States that if they harmed Gaddafi, they would have to deal with the angels of death, pointing directly at the El Rookins. This incident marked the beginning of the intense government investigation into the El Rookins as an extremist Islamic terrorist group, fueled by the misconception that they were ready to commit acts of terror for Gaddafi. Later that year, the El Rooks tried to gain legitimacy as a religious entity in the Illinois prison system to secure rights of assembly. Authorities feared this was a plot to organize criminal endeavors and intimidate other inmates. The suit was rejected. In 1986, the El Rookins entered the murder-for-hire business. Noah Robinson, Jesse Jackson's half-brother, paid the El Rookins $10,000 to murder his enemy, Leroy Hambone Barber, in South Carolina. The hit squad, including Alan Knox and Edgar Cooksey, executed Barber on January 2, 1986. A witness, Janice D. Rosman, was later stabbed by an associate of Robinson and subsequently refused to testify. Robinson and the El Rookins involved were eventually convicted. In March 1986, the El Rooms, leveraging the Farrakhan connection, sought to contact Gaddafi directly to obtain $2.5 million, half of the sum Farrakhan had allegedly received, to build a larger temple and grow their religious flock. The US government alleged this money was meant to fund acts of terror, including the destruction of government buildings. Ford, sitting in a Texas federal prison, allegedly negotiated the transaction in complex codes. This suspicion intensified in the summer of 1986 when FBI informant Sam Buford set up a cocaine deal between undercover agent Willie Hulan and General Alan Knox. Hulan baited Knox by mentioning a connection who stole military gear. Knox took the bait, asking about a grenade launcher. A month later, Knox and Melvin Mays met the agents and paid $1,900 for an M72 anti-tank law rocket launcher. Knox mentioned wanting to blow up an enemy's building. The rocket, which was inactivated and contained a tracking device, was traced back to the El Ruknin property, the African Hut, 64th and Kenwood. A subsequent raid of the African Hut found 32 guns, including a MAC-10 machine gun and armor-piercing bullets. In September 1986, the government indicted Jeff Fort, Alan Knox, Melvin Mays, and others on conspiracy charges involving murder, drugs, and plots of terrorism. On November 19, 1986, Willie Morris Fluky Stokes, a notorious Chicago drug dealer who worked with the El Rokins, was shot dead. Charles Edward Bay, an original Black P. Stone member whose territory Stokes was infringing upon, was accused of ordering the hit allegedly carried out by El Rokins as retaliation for an earlier assassination attempt on Bay by Stokes' men. When crack cocaine exploded nationwide in 1986, becoming the poor man's cocaine due to its cheap price and intense addictive properties, Jeff Fort drew a hard line. Ford had reluctantly allowed the sale of heroin in 1985 only because it was the only way to make enough money to uplift the nation, and he believed the El Rook could at least control the flow and violence associated with the drug. Heroin, an opioid, generally led to docile addicts once they got their fix. Crack, however, was a powerful stimulant that turned addicts into desperate, violent robbers and thieves, causing immense social destruction. Fort was disgusted and condemned the use and sale of crack cocaine, strictly forbidding El Ruknin's involvement. He also used the El Ruknin's influence to keep crack dealers out of El Ruknin-dominated communities, Woodlawn, South Shore, Kenwood, Oakland. Fort's successful enforcement of this ban was respected, even by some law enforcement officials. The conspiracy trials began on October 7, 1987. The star witness was Flip, General Tremel Davis, who received $10,000 for his expert testimony interpreting the coded phone conversations between Fort and his generals. The prosecution used Davis to interpret codes as plots for terror attacks financed by Libya, despite Libyan officials emphatically denying any terror plots. The original claim by El Rooks and Davis himself that the money was for a new temple, the defense establishing that Davis had no expertise in the codes until he began studying them as a witness. The trial was marred by intense witness intimidation by the El Rooks. Gunshots were fired into the apartment of Tremel Davis's wife. Thelma Tedder, mother of key witness Anthony Sumner, was gunned down outside her apartment. Jury members reported receiving threatening phone calls, forcing the judge to order the jury to be sequestered and denied telephone access. The trial finished on November 24, 1987. Jeff Fort was convicted and sentenced to 80 years in prison, plus a hefty fine. Other top generals received decades-long sentences. Fort was sent to Marion Prison. In 1988, the old guard suffered a fatal blow. Ray Scooter East, Titanic Peace Stone leader, died after swallowing drugs to conceal evidence, which burst when police beat him. Then, in September 1988, Eugene Harrison was shot to death execution style outside the Ida B. Wells projects. His supporters blamed the El Ruknis and Fort, though the El Ruknis publicly proclaimed their innocence and the case was never solved. Harrison had become a heroin addict, making his death a target of speculation, e.g. drug debts. Without the Titanics and Harrison, the Black P. Stones were left vulnerable. In October 1988, Jeff Fort received an additional 75 years for the 1981 murder of Willie Dollar Bill Bibbs. In late 1989, authorities delivered the final blow with a new round of convictions indicting 65 members across 8 states. The Fort headquarters at 3947 S. Drexel was raided for the final time on October 29, 1989, using blow torches and hammers. Even though El Runts were deep in prayer, full ma'ah, and offered no resistance, they were charged with mob action and disorderly conduct for merely assembling. The building was sealed with cement and the property sat vacant. This sweep also sealed the fate of Noah Robinson, convicted for the 1986 murder for hire and skimming $650,000 from Wendy's cash registers. The use of RICO charges swept up both low-level and high-profile El Rukne members. In the summer of 1990, the fort was demolished in a public ceremony celebrating the war on drugs, as authorities sought to remove a symbol of gang and drug activity. Many onlookers cheered and gathered bricks as souvenirs. Interestingly, the property surrounding the fort later became highly valuable and gentrified, leading some to speculate that real estate acquisition was a hidden motive behind the dismantling of the El Ruknos. As the mighty El Rukn Empire crumbled under relentless prosecution in the late 1980s, the Stones slowly began to make a comeback. Maniac P. Stones, The Bridge. The Maniac P. Stones, formerly Maniac Rangers, led the charge. Their younger generation had been groomed by high-ranking family-connected El-Ruckans and were exempt from sanctions. They were taught the ruthless military-like building 74th Place and Kingston. Maniacs were pivotal in pushing the P back into Black P. Stone, standing up to El-Ruckan sanctions as the prosecution intensified. They were a force operating in a tight alliance with the Mickey Cobras, Reubenite Stones, and the leadership void. In 1990, former Four Cornerstone leader Randy Rube Dillard, while incarcerated in Menard, seized control of the BPSN, creating the Reubenite Stones. The Titanic P. Stones officially went defunct that year, though they would resurface later. Dillard, famous for stabbing serial killer John Wayne Gacy in prison, started the Reubenites aggressively in northern Inglewood. Its sons of Jet Ford attempted to take over, but Antonio Prince Akeem Ford was disapproved of by his father due to his drug problem. The more influential son was Prince Wakita Valenzuela Ford, who allied himself with the Stones rather than the embattled El Runes. Wakita rose up in the Jet Blackstone branch. In 1990, he took over the Jet Blacks in the back of the yards area, 54th and Honnold, and challenged the King Cobras and conservative vice lords who ran the drug trade in Motown. When the Cobras and CVLs refused to cut him in, Wakita raised an army, pushing them out. Motown became a stone hood once again, expanding to span 53rd to 57th Streets from Ashland to Low, establishing the largest stone presence in Inglewood, West Inglewood, and the back of the yards. Wakita was eventually imprisoned in 1997 for cocaine trafficking. After the final convictions were handed down at the end of 1991, Jeff Ford in prison called upon all Stone groups and El Rucks to unite back under one nation. The El Rucknu group dissolved, absorbing back into the original Black P. Stones. The nation unified, restoring the faith in the P, making Islamic beliefs optional though still respected rather than mandatory. The center of the reassembled BPSN remained the South Side, particularly Woodlawn and South Shore. The 1990 brought the full onslaught of crack cocaine into Stone territories, and young Stones began pushing it, leading to internal conflicts. Discipline eroded as leaders were jailed. Prince Wakita went down in 1997, and Antonio Ford was found murdered that same year. Jeff Ford was eventually transferred to the Florence, Colorado Supermax facility to cut him off from all contact with the BPSN. The Stones, lacking a central disciplined street leadership, became decentralized and heavily entrenched in the drug business. The Black P. Stone Nation has grown into a massive organization with at least 20,000 members nationwide, with a presence in almost all 50 states and across Chicago. The organization was built on strong leadership and organization, but its history is largely unknown by many young members today. The origins of the Stones trace back to the 1950s socioeconomic crises in Woodlawn and Inglewood, fueled by white flight and redlining. White communities left, taking tax dollars and businesses, while banks classified these areas as hopeless, starving Black entrepreneurs of loans and opportunities. This created a lack of jobs, leading young Black males to resort to the streets, pimping, hustling, drug sales for survival. The Blackstone Raiders/Rangers were created as a self-defense mechanism against racist white greaser gangs and to control the rackets in the community, initially aiming to protect residents from exploitation and police brutality. Under Jeff Ford, they directed their efforts toward the Black Power movement and secured government funding for job training programs. Law enforcement viewed the rising power of the Stones and their Black Power message as a threat, fearing a massive organized group of Black men. They employed tactics to disrupt the leadership, including setting up Stones and disciples against each other and exploiting the mismanagement of government grant money, which was partially due to lack of guidance and internal corruption. The Aruthan transformation into an Islamic movement with a ruthless, organized killer squad to fund their cause and impose strict law and order on their streets. No crack, no gang graffiti, no victimizing residents. Only intensified government fear, especially amid tensions with Middle Eastern nations like Libya. The terrorism charges in the Libya trials were secured despite key issues. The star witness, Tramell Davis, received special treatment, phone calls, sexual contact that tainted his credibility and led to many convictions being overturned by 1993. There was no evidence that the $2.5 million was ever exchanged or that actual terror plots were finalized. The government unfairly combined drug and murder charges into the terrorism trial to ensure a conviction, a strategy that automatically stripped the defendants of certain rights. The question remains, would leaders like Jeff Fort, now in Supermax, still be incarcerated for decades if the terrorism charges, which lacked firm evidence, hadn't been leveraged? The high sentences against the L Runts far surpassed those typically handed down for intergang murders. The text concludes with the Kingpin paradox, echoing a scene from Chicago PD. Highly organized criminals like Fort or the fictional Darius Walker, while running illegal enterprises like heroin, but notably keeping crack out, often invest back into the community and maintain a brutal but functioning order. Their removal by law enforcement often results in the chaos of decentralized, ruthless, young-half-wit gangbangers who lack structure and leadership, leading to a much worse state of street violence. The Stones, despite their criminal elements, retain a core philosophy of productivity and spiritual upliftment, with many members nationwide living completely law-abiding lives as professionals and community leaders.